Okay, so we're going to keep talking about the culture of the 1950s, and then we'll be getting sort of setting it up to how all of that is leading us to the civil rights movement, and all of these social movements that are about to take place to sort of like counteract what's been going on with all of this sort of 1950s conformity we've been seeing. So in the 1950s, we also see a new religious revival. The last time we saw a religious revival was in the 1920s, or after World War I, and it was for the same reason that we see a revival in the 1950s. It's about communism. So communism is often associated with atheism. So this is mostly out of reaction to the large number of atheist-based communist societies that are popping up. Not to say that just because someone is a communist that they're an atheist, and not just because someone's an atheist that they're a communist. The two are not necessarily related, but we definitely have that perception, and a lot of people still do have that perception. So regular church attendance in the 1950s is also going to go up by about 30 million, which is a lot. That's a lot of people going to church on a regular basis. Another reason you could say for this might be the baby boom. People, I find, are more likely to go to church and get involved with community activities when they have a family than when they're like single and on their own. So I definitely think the baby boom had a fair amount to do with that. But because of this religious revival, Congress and the president will do two things that have marked the United States still to this day. The first is Congress will add 4 words to United States currency: "In God we trust," and it is still there. And then Eisenhower will add 2 words to the Pledge of Allegiance, and they are "under God." So before the 1950s, that just wasn't in the Pledge of Allegiance. We just didn't say that part. So if you're looking at this picture and you're like, why does she have these kids down here, it looks like they're saluting Hitler or something. But that's not what they're doing. They're actually saying the Pledge of Allegiance. So before World War II, that was the salute that we gave to the flag when we said the Pledge of Allegiance. But obviously, after World War II, we're going to associate that with the Heil Hitler salute, and we will move to this right here, the hand over our heart type of Pledge of Allegiance that we still do today. So we can't talk about 50s culture and not talk about rock and roll. It's a big part of it. So rock and roll, really, we can, the growth and the importance of rock and roll, we can contribute, or we can attribute to this guy here on the right, Alan Freed. So Alan Freed was a DJ. DJ stands for disc jockey, if you didn't know. So Alan Freed was a DJ in the Midwest, in like Ohio, I think, and he started playing music that most people at that time called race music. And race music is basically black music. That's what they mean, music by black musicians. And rock and roll at that time was largely made up of black musicians. It draws its roots from rhythm and blues, from R&B, and R&B is obviously of the black community, which draws its roots from the jazz movement of the 1920s, which got its start in, Harlem. So really, rock and roll can be very easily traced back to the black community. So a lot of people were very sort of wary of it. It wasn't like socially acceptable for like the majority of people to be into rock and roll music at the time, so they didn't call it rock and roll, they called it race music. But Alan Freed is going to start playing it on his radio show, which had tons and tons of viewers, and he will call it rock and roll. So people will start listening to it more, and it will just absolutely blow up, and he'll end up having a huge radio show out of New York after a while, and expose a lot of people to black and white R&B and rock and roll artists over the radio. So as I said, rock and roll draws its roots from R&B, and so a lot of rock and roll musicians had a background in R&B and in like Southern music. And Elvis is a perfect example. So obviously Elvis is considered to be the king of rock and roll. He grew up in a segregated Memphis, and he had always listened to R&B growing up, and was also really involved in Southern gospel. He even released several Southern gospel albums. So rock and roll is just sort of like the next logical step when we've been involved in music like that before. So he recorded his first hit, which was Heartbreak Hotel, and it sold millions. And then he was invited to sing on the Ed Sullivan Show, which was like the talk show in the 1950s. Even now, Jimmy Fallon on The Tonight Show will have a musical guest at the end of his show. That really started back with Ed Sullivan in the 1950s. So he brought Elvis onto the Ed Sullivan Show, but the cameraman would only film him from the waist up because of his tight pants and his dance moves. They thought it would be too scandalous for television. So very early on, we're associating rock and roll with, chaos and sex and violence and drinking and all of this, bad, quote unquote, bad things. So ministers largely, while we're seeing the birth of rock and roll here, we're also seeing that religious revival and that conformity nuclear family type of thing we've talked about before. So a lot of ministers were complaining about the effects of rock, and Congress even held a huge hearing on an investigation on the subversive effects of the nature of rock and roll music and things like that. So not everyone, though, is going to buy into that. Obviously, the more your parents tell you not to like something, a lot of times the more teenagers like it anyway. So we're going to see those baby boomers just totally falling for rock and roll, and that's going to keep on going into the 60s and 70s. So not everyone, as you can see, is down for the conformity and I guess you would say conservatism of the 1950s. We have plenty of critics of that 50s culture. So the authors who were known for criticizing the conformity and consumerism and conservative ism, I guess, of the 1950s, they're called Beatniks. I've got that written right here, Beatniks. So there are two Beatniks I want you to know. The first is David Reisman, who I've got here on the bottom left. He wrote a book called The Lonely Crowd. And The Lonely Crowd is all about individuality and conformity in community. He said that Americans are sacrificing their individuality in order to conform and to fit into their community, and that can cause people a lot of problems. It can lead to depression when you don't feel like yourself because you're just doing things because that's what you think society expects of you, or just so that you can fit in. You're not really happy. It's like, what's the point of fitting in if you aren't happy? That's sort of like what he was saying. And then the other person I want you to know is here on the right, this angel right here, the OG feminist of all feminists, is Betty Friedan. And she published this book called The Feminine Mystique, which was like an absolute hit. Like you see, it says on the book down there, 1.5 million copies sold in its first print. People have absolutely loved this book. It's still a major hit among women's activists today. So Betty Friedan in The Feminine Mystique wrote about the plight of the 1950s housewife, the June Cleavers of the world, talking about the status of women in American society and how we've put this pressure on women to, if you're going to college just to find a man, and then when you found a man, you drop out and you get married and you start having kids and you start the cycle all over. But that's not what we should be doing. We're putting our women at a disadvantage because we're suppressing all these leadership and all these leadership skills and this intelligence and these like groundbreaking women who could be doing so many things, and we're just like shoving them into a little box and saying that they need to be having kids and getting married, taking care of their husband and doing all of these things, when in reality that might not necessarily be living up to their full potential. We should be encouraging women to reach beyond that. If that's what they want to do, that should be their choice, but society should encourage women to make whatever choice best fits them. So that's sort of what she wrote about in The Feminine Mystique. I definitely recommend that if you're into anything like that. But there are plenty of novelists who were beatnik authors as well, like Jack Kerouac, who wrote On the Road, which is a very popular book. Jack Kerouac is an interesting author. He was an alcoholic, but a beautiful writer, and he wrote some pretty incredible things. I definitely would recommend his work to you. So now we're getting into sort of the bad, more of the bad. I guess we've talked about the bad a little bit. The conformity isn't super lovely, but we're going to be talking about more of the bad side of the 1950s. So because of all of that growth of the suburbs, more wealthy and middle class families are leaving cities. So that means cities are losing money because the middle class is the largest portion of their tax base. So the people paying taxes into cities are lower class, so there's less money collected in taxes. So this is going to lead to a decline in the conditions of cities and the emergence of the inner city, the worst parts of the city, where crime is the highest and poverty rates are the highest. So a lot of cities will start to launch urban renewal projects in an effort to reverse this trend. They're going to rearrange cities to build new roads and highways, but this mostly is just going to backfire because it forces people to live in smaller spaces. And conditions are going to be just as bad for the rural poor as they are for the poor in the cities. We're still seeing problems for farmers, miners, sharecroppers. They're all still really suffering. And now we're getting into how this is all affecting our minorities. So I'm going to talk about 3 minority groups here, starting with Puerto Ricans. So the 40s and 50s, we're seeing a lot of Puerto Ricans moving to New York City, and they're largely going to be clustered together in some of the poorest neighborhoods. They had very little political power because so few of them spoke English, and they had a really hard time getting improvements to their communities made by the government. If you've seen West Side Story, which is on your movie list for this unit, you see the Puerto Rican community in New York City. It's a beautiful movie. Mexican Americans are also still experiencing a lot of poverty and problems with that. So remember during World War II, we saw that Bracero program taking place to recruit Mexicans to come to the United States and work on farms and ranches. And now that the Bracero program is over, that doesn't mean that it's over. The immigration is over. That's still going to be happening. So people are still coming to the United States to work on American farms, and a lot of them are treated very, very roughly. Children were often expected to work alongside their parents. If anyone complained about the working conditions or the lack of pay, employers would just threaten to have them deported. So the U.S. Department of Labor did this huge investigation and published a massive report, and they basically said that it was legalized slavery, that these Mexican workers in the Southwest were being treated very similar to how African Americans had been treated as slaves in the antebellum period, which, as I'm sure you remember from American History 1, was horrible. And then lastly, Native Americans. So in 1953, we passed something called the Termination Policy, which sought to end, number one, tribal organizations, and they wanted to relocate a lot of natives to the cities. And then two, it also ended federal health care and welfare for Native Americans. Now, the thought process behind the Termination Policy was to help Native Americans truly have a permanent place in American society by sort of like ending their dependency on the federal government and encouraging them to get more involved with the rest of the United States. But in the end, it's just going to make things worse because it ultimately sends the Native American community into an even deeper economic depression. And even today, we see Native American communities with higher rates of poverty, obesity, addiction, and mental illness. All right, so here we are, the Civil Rights Movement. We can't get into the Civil Rights Movement without talking about where it all really begins in the 50s, which is with segregation. So there are two types of segregation you need to know: de jure segregation and de facto segregation. So de jure segregation is segregation imposed by law, so schools, public places, drinking fountains, things like that. Plessy v. Ferguson, if you remember, upheld de jure segregation, saying that separate is okay as long as it's equal. De facto segregation is segregation by custom or tradition. So segregation in neighborhoods or churches. You know, it's not legal for a white person to attend a black church or a black person to attend a white church. And they wouldn't necessarily be looked down on for doing that, but they would get some looks, and it would be sort of like the odd man out type of situation. And that is much harder to change because that's a generational belief. It's much harder to change people's minds. So during World War II, we saw racism and the struggle of the black community having a new light shined on it, but nothing other than AH2 had really been accomplished. So the NAACP is going to be fighting for some real change in the 50s, and they're going to be trying to end segregation, and that's finally going to happen with Brown v. Board of Education. So in the 40s, the NAACP lawyers started to file lawsuits all over the South to challenge the legality of segregation, and Thurgood Marshall is really going to be leading this path, and they're going to win several important cases, but they're going to be on more local and state levels, cases like Gaines v. Canada and Sweat v. Painter. But they needed something federal that would impact segregation on all levels, all grade levels, all schools. So finally in 1954, they ruled in Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, that segregation was illegal and that the practice of segregation was to end immediately because it was unconstitutional. They called for the desegregation of all schools with, quote, all deliberate speed, which means immediately. Now, obviously, a lot of the South is not going to have a positive reaction to this. In 1956, a group of about 100 congressmen led by this guy, Strom Thurmond, here on the right, signed something called the Southern Manifesto, which basically said that they were going to use every lawful measure possible to stop integration from happening. We're also going to see a new revival in the KKK because of this, and the creation of new groups like the White Citizens Council, whose logo you see on the bottom right says states' rights and racial equality, and they're more trying to combat integration and equality on the legal side, while the KKK is doing it on the much more of like intimidating and the illegal side of things.